One of the things that I have noticed in our time together over the last 3 years is the importance of place and our specific sites and the importance of place to those sites. I was thrilled to see the exhibit earlier, the temporary exhibit by John Hollicott called The Landscape of Desire. And there's a quote from his narrative in that exhibit that I jotted down because it's perfect for this talk. He says, landscapes exist in a transitional state between vanishing and becoming visible, suggesting a reality on the verge of disappearing or re-emerging before our eyes. So I wanted to take a few minutes today to talk about the importance of place through a particular place, a particular immigrant gateway, which I know from my work as the project director and guest curator of Forgotten Gateway Coming to America through Galveston Island at the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum. I do so with the hope that a renewed sensitivity to the power of place can continue to help us all home in on the particular exigencies and ethics that comprise the multiple narratives of our particular sites. So I begin with this mid-century woodcut view of Galveston and a quote from a journal entry of a 19th century immigrant to the U.S. through the port of Galveston who says, "From the sea, the appearance of Galveston is that of a fine city of great extent, built close upon the edge of the water, but its glory vanishes gradually in proportion to the nearness of the approach." The question that occurs to me as I read this quote is, what is it about a place whose appearance can change so dramatically the closer we get, the more we see, the closer we come to embody its shore? What is it about a place whose glory vanishes in proportion to the nearness of its approach? And what is it that seems so glorious? What is it that vanishes from view? What exactly makes us think we can assess a place by its first appearance, when that assessment is made in the liminal space between land and sea, knowing and longing, going and coming, memory and forgetting? Post-colonial writers would caution that place and space are not the same thing. Rather, they would argue place is a complex interaction of language, history, and environment, characterized first by a gap between the experienced environment and the environment that language provides. This sense of displacement, of a lack of fit between language and environment, is experienced both by those who are born to a place and those who arrive anew. Place, says writers such as Apadurai and Gupta and others, is not something that's simply there, but is in a continual process of being written, imagined, mythologized. Place, in this sense, is language, something in constant flux, a discourse in process. And this is especially true, I would argue, for those whose experience of place is not an experience of being in or of a place, but of arriving to a place. Not of belonging so much, but of arriving. Not of knowing, but of imagining. New York Harbor, with its image of the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island, is one such place that is repeatedly mythologized in the immigrant imaginings of those who arrive from afar to the United States. What about the dozen or so other seaport destinations that greeted or detained, deported, or even enslaved newcomers on America's eastern, western, and southern shores? Each gateway city embodied its own narratives of arrival and mythologies of place based on their own complex intersections of language, history, and environment. It's no accident, perhaps, that several of these gateway cities are literally islands, places located betwixt and between sea and shore, unmoored, in a sense, from solid ground, vulnerable to the exigencies of wind and weather, awaiting the imprint of narrative to give them substance and to anchor their realities. At the close of the 19th century, in the shadow of the most devastating hurricane in our nation's history at that time, Galveston was one of the nation's top 10 ports of entry. It was also known as Texas's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan city, the Wall Street of the West. Since 1845, more than 100,000 immigrants had entered the United States through the city, some to join friends and families, others attracted by aid societies and land agents, promising a pleasant climate. Galveston was also a port of entry for those forced into migration. Before the Civil War, the city housed markets for the auction and purchase of slaves who had been shipped from other southern states or illegally smuggled from Africa and the Caribbean. In less than 3/4 of a century, Galveston underwent a dramatic transformation from a sleepy barrier island port before the Civil War to a cosmopolitan steamship and railroad hub in the second half of the 1800s, and back to a nearly abandoned immigrant gateway after the devastating storms of nature and war at the start of the 20th century. So I want to take a look today at some of the images that are mythologized in words and in quilts and in traditional arts that look at the narrative and the language of place. And I want to look particularly at 3 eras of Galveston's history by focusing on 3 quotes. Scene 1, Galveston, mid-1800s. I depart voluntarily from my teaching position. I leave Germany, exchanging comfort for toil, the familiar pen for the unfamiliar space, but I will be a free man in a free earth. This is Dr. Ernst Knapp from 1840s. I stood on the slave block in the blazing sun for at least 2 hours. My legs ached. My hunger had become unbearable. I was filled with terror and did not know what was to become of me. That's a quote from Jeff Hamilton, who was a slave at the Galveston auction house. Just as the ox pulls the cart, the movement of people to Texas before the Civil War also had its driving force. In one case, it was fair words praising the beauty and benefit of Texas and its land. In another case, it was also advertising that marketed Galveston as a place where people could come not just to buy land, but to buy human beings, slaves. In both of the passages cited above, the narrators depict a moment of dislocation when all that is familiar is stripped from them and they are faced with unrequited hope for one and abject terror for the other, with the unknown of a new future in a new land of Texas. Galveston for both is depicted as a kind of chimera, blinding in the new day's sun without benefit of words or clothes or nourishment to protect them. For those like Ernst Knapp coming to Texas in the mid-19th century, the promise was land, and lots of it, to own, to farm, to homestead. Land equaled wealth, or at least the promise of wealth. It was the wellspring of dreams, the siren's call that reached across dangerous waters. As seen in this scrimshaw that says hope, the prime motivator for those coming voluntarily from Europe and Galveston was the point of entry to this mythic land of milk and honey. As one European newcomer made note, Galveston for Texas, a big city, looked to the Europeans like a setup of paper toys. The houses stood on posts, ready to be moved from one place to another. But if Galveston's facade seemed somewhat childlike for the sophisticated Europeans, there was nothing whimsical about it for those arriving from the bottom of the ship in chains. These are chains from Texas. Before the Civil War, Galveston was not only the largest immigrant port west of New Orleans, it was the largest port for the burgeoning slave market as well. Slaves came to Galveston not as immigrants, but as property, something more valuable than land. Growing cotton and sugar cane took a lot of labor, resulting in a market for men, women, and children who were forced to migrate to Texas. Some slaves were brought to Texas with their owners from other southern states. Others were brought elsewhere and transported by ship to Galveston, where they were met by plantation owners. Still others were brought to Texas in lots and sold to the highest bidder at local auction houses. This is the J.S. Sidner auction house. He was a former mayor of Galveston, was reputed to be the Texas's largest slave dealer. Every Tuesday, he advertised the week's sale of merchandise: a keg of nails, 10 boxes of tobacco, a buggy and harness, and 30 Negroes. John Sidner's home, this is a quilt made by a slave family that was brought to Texas by their owners. Here's John Sidner's home. Was built by the famed architect William Clayton, stands today as one of Galveston's signature stops on its famed architecture tour. But while John Sidner's house or residence is praised, slaves were not thought of as living anywhere because they were thought of as property. This is a slave manifest from 1844 or 46, and you can see in the column to the right that it says residence. All of these people, their residence is on board. So scene 2, Galveston, the Ellis Island of the Gulf. These are rich and fertile lands, so cheap that the laboring man may get his board and 10 acres for an honest month's work, and the rich man find large profits upon his investments. William Kingsbury, 1883. The only remedy for unreliable black labor is the introduction of intelligent white laborers from other countries, who by their competition and example would quickly change the unnatural state of things. In the second half of the 1800s, Texas was no longer a wild frontier. It was a well-promoted product to be sold. Land was plentiful, fares were cheap, jobs were easy to come by, and railroad barons linked forces with steamship companies to whisk immigrants straight to their new homes. Ho for Texas seemed to be the cry in all parts of the Union. Never has there been such a rush to the Lone Star State. And advertisements all over Europe and the United States advertising, "Come to Texas," the land of opportunity. While the elite of Texas, and here you see an image of Texas from a brochure of Galveston from the Chamber of Commerce, where Galveston is seen literally as the center of the universe, the center of the United States. While the elite of Galveston were promoting their city as the Wall Street of the Gulf and the center of Texas high society, its African American community danced in the streets on June 16, 1865, in celebration of Juneteenth, Major General Gordon Granger's public reading of General Order No. 3, which abolished slavery. I've heard urban, sophisticated African Americans say that Juneteenth is foolishness, a made-up holiday. They're embarrassed by the funny name, the tradition of drinking red soda pop, and so on. It's that awful watermelon stigma that taints all things that are simple and fun, and a yearning to forget the slavery thing. That's a quote by the artist who made this, George White, who began late in life to carve images of African American life when he was 58 years old. This is a painting by an African American named Walter Cotton called "Reading the Emancipation Proclamation on the Governor Stroud Plantation, June 19, 1865, which portrays plantation overseer E.E. Rogers reading the document to the slaves, and behind him stamps plantation owner Logan Stroud. And Logan Stroud's portrait looks kind of like the figure of Prince Albert on the tobacco can, because that's what Cotton said all those guys looked like. This is Cheri Byrd, an African-American quilter who quilts the history of her family's migration to Texas in this double-sided quilt, homegrown, handmade, and passed on family. After emancipation in Texas, some African Americans filled jobs formerly given to immigrants as workers on the Galveston docks, for example, but others lost their livelihoods to immigrants who were brought to replace them as plantation and railroad workers. This is a image from Harper's Weekly in 1870 that depicted 250 Chinese that were brought to Texas from California after building the transcontinental railroads to come to Texas and build railroads from Galveston west. And this is a picture of Joe Lung and his wife Dora, who were brought at that time to build the railroads and stay. Scene 3, the gates narrow. The present predominating immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe is inferior, on the whole, to the old North European immigration. It contains many undesirable and unintelligent people. That's William Williams, Commissioner of Immigration at Ellis Island, 1903. The examining doctors at Galveston were especially zealous in finding causes for exclusion. So in 1907, there were a lot of people deported back to Europe because of trachoma or suspected of trachoma. It was sort of an epidemic. That's Libby Kahn, who was an immigrant in the early 20th century through Galveston. By the turn of the 20th century, more immigrants were coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, while fewer were coming from Northern Europe. Anti-immigrant sentiment rose toward these Italian, Greek, Russian, and Polish newcomers whose religion, appearance, and political orientation were different from those who had come before. Some worried that they were taking jobs away from native-born Americans. This is a sign from 1882, restrict all immigration, protect yourself and your children against ruinous labor and business competition. These are immigrants coming from Germany, from Bremen, in the turn of the 20th century, and here's how the process worked. Newcomers disembarked with their luggage, and their outer garments were tagged with their manifest number from the steamship. A medical officer and immigration inspector reviewed each person, either aboard ship or upon arrival. The inspectors screened out those barred by U.S. immigration laws. They determined who was incurably ill, disabled, criminal, or unable to fend for themselves, all of which could be sufficient grounds for exclusion. Immigrants waited for hours to be examined. These are some of the first Jewish immigrants that were brought to the United States through Galveston as part of a special immigration movement in the early 20th century. This is a document from Galveston in 1910 that lists all of the people who were excluded: idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, etc. Here are people waiting in the cotton wharves of Galveston because there was no immigration station at the time until a federal immigration station was built in the early 20th century. There was a big emphasis on the physical state of the foreign alien, reflected in increased physical inspections for the eye infection of trachoma, as well as other infections. And during this period, 42 cases of trachoma were certified. This was the early 20th century period. And there was a much larger case of people who were deported from Galveston than were deported from Ellis Island, both because of physical deformities and also women who were thought to be prostitutes. Listen to the words of the head medical inspector who wrote to the Surgeon General of the United States asking that really that Jews not be allowed, that Hebrews not be allowed. He says, "The handicap which the enumerated defects impose upon their victims is in itself bad enough, but I cannot refrain from inviting attention to what is really a very important and inadequately considered phase of the defect mentioned in the sufferer. These immigrants are still within their reproductive period and may reasonably be expected, if landed, to become parents of native-born citizens. The resultant children will therefore furnish more than their proper quota of mental, moral, and physical degenerates." So this was this eugenics argument for disallowing people who were considered undesirable and inappropriate. This is the Ku Klux Klan Day in Texas in 1923. And I just want to leave you with this description of the Ku Klux Klan Day in Texas. If you went to the Texas State Fair in Dallas on October 24th, 1923, you would have seen 150,000 people celebrating the fair's official Ku Klux Klan Day. Many fairgoers were dressed in white robes and hoods. The KKK band played patriotic songs. An Imperial Wizard Hiram Evans' speech titled "Immigration is America's Big Problem" stirred the crowd. He noted that the success of the United States rested on its ability, quote, to fuse into a true Americanism the various nationalities that have flown into the country through immigration, casting aside as dross those materials that cannot be assimilated. Then he got to the point and cited three groups that were absolutely unblendable: Negroes, Jews, and Catholics. Throughout the day, fairgoers sported KKK badges, and some of the rodeo cowboys wore Klan regalia and robes while performing. At 9 p.m., in front of the grandstand, masked Klansmen initiated 5,631 candidates into the organization before a supportive crowd of 25,000 people. Crosses burned as crusaders sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers," and the festivities ended with a downtown parade. The final turnstile count was around 150,000, somewhat less than expected, but the occasion generated tremendous publicity for the Klan and considerable revenue for the fair. Soon after this point, Galveston shut down as a federal immigration station, or actually just before this point, and never again would Galveston have the numbers of immigrants coming through its border. But the sense of place of Galveston as a national immigrant port was built into the very landscape of Galveston. Today you can go on tours of Galveston as an immigrant port. What is erased from that landscape is the narrative of forced migration to Galveston, as well as the story of contemporary immigrants, at least before Hurricane Rita a couple of years ago, a large Mexican population who are invisibilized throughout the city of Galveston. So as we go back to our home sites, I urge us to look at the local lore, the local writings, and the local art of the people in our sites to tell us even more about the way the landscape itself is written with the immigrant story on it. Thank you.